Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to give you guys a quick rundown of DaVinci Resolve 17, the general workflow of the video editor, and some details about the new features that you can find in the DaVinci Resolve 17 public beta. So when you boot up DaVinci Resolve 17 for the first time, you're going to see the project window where you can create a new project down here at the bottom. A couple things to note here. In thumbnail mode, which is the default, you can actually scrub through a video that you've already been working on. So scrubbing through your old video projects like this, you can see some thumbnail images from the timeline that you were working on and get a better idea of exactly which video project that was. Also, you can switch to list view up here at the top right, which gives you different columns of information about the video projects you are working on. You can also right click up here in order to toggle some of those columns on and off as you need them. So as we talk about Resolve, you'll also see that the thumbnail and list view options exist on many of the windows inside of Resolve as well. So go ahead and hit new project, create your project by giving it a name, and then we'll just open that up. So when you get into the project, you're going to be on one of the 7 different pages of DaVinci Resolve, which you can see at the bottom going from media to deliver. So right now we're on the edit page. We'll talk about that later. I'm going to jump over to the media page on the far left, since generally the workflow is going to go from media and then progress to the right. So probably the most essential window inside of media mode is media storage. So we can see that up at the top left and toggle it on and off if we want by left clicking it. So any of the windows that you'll see at the top of the screen can be toggled on and off. So for instance, the inspector, which you'll see in other tabs, can be clicked on and off just like this. So that's an important thing to remember. So as for the media storage itself, you'll see network locations that have been mapped in Resolve on the left. So basically, if you want a folder to be easily accessible, to be able to click onto it and then to find video files inside of it or inside of nested subfolders, then you want to add it over here on the left. So if you want to add a folder, then you can right click down here and choose add new location. From there, you just need to select a location on your computer and then hit select folder. So inside of media storage, when you open up your folder, by default, we have the same thumbnail view as the project. When you click on one of these folders, you're going to have the same thumbnail view from the project window, except now we're looking at video clips that exist on our computer. So these aren't actually in our project yet. If we want to bring one into the project, then we want to left click, hold, and drag it down here to where it says no clips in the media pool. When you do bring your video clip into the pool here, it may give you the pop-up message to change the project frame rate to match the video clip. Since it's a good idea to generally edit videos in the same frames per second that they were recorded in. So if you want to see your project settings, then you can go up to the File menu and go down to Project Settings here, or Shift 9 on the keyboard. And you can come down here to where we see Master Settings. So for Master Settings, this project is at 23.976 frames per second. You can change it to something else like 30 frames per second if you prefer. But once you start editing, this timeline frame rate is going to be locked, so make sure it's set correctly at the start of your project. So there's another way you can actually bring video files into your project, and that is to use Windows Explorer. So if I open up Windows Explorer on my desktop here, and I have a couple files here, I can left click and drag one of these videos into the project by dragging it into the media pool. So now this file is also in my project. And that's important to note if you do want to skip the media tab, because the cut page and the edit page also have media pools, which are for containing the files in your project. And from here, you can bring them onto the timeline. So technically, if you wanted, you could just be on the edit page, open up Windows Explorer, and then bring your video file right into here. So now let's jump over to the edit page. This is where most of the magic is going to happen, I would say. On the edit page, you have the timeline, and you can put videos onto the timeline for you to edit them, create effects and titles and all of that jazz, and as well as edit properties about the video over here in the inspector. So let's put a video clip onto the timeline and talk about those each in a little bit of detail. So putting my video onto the timeline, I'm just going to move my sticky notes over here for now. We have our video clip in the timeline, and if we want to play it back, we can hit the play in this preview window over here. So playing it back just like a video on any app like VLC Player. And now we can go ahead and start making edits to it. So one of the most basic and common ways to edit your video is to make a cut and split one clip into 2 clips. So we do that using the Blade Edit Mode tool which is B on the keyboard, or you can left click to select it. And you find where you want to make a cut, and then you go ahead and left click. Note that as you scrub left and right, it's going to update the preview window to wherever you're hovering above the timeline, rather than wherever this big timeline cursor, the red one, happens to be located. So you find a spot you want to make a cut, and then you left click to make the cut. Super simple. So if you want to make additional cuts, you can do that just by going forward and left clicking every time you want to cut. So now let's say hypothetically we wanted to remove this middle piece here. It's now its own separate clip. We can hit A or left click on this arrow to go back to selection mode. And then we can left click on the clip we want to get rid of and hit delete. So when you hit delete on your keyboard, it's going to do a ripple delete. Notice how when you get rid of that old clip, that there's no black space. So anything from the right gets pushed over to the left to sandwich together with the left clips and making sure that all of the black space is filled. If you don't want that, instead you can left click it and then hit Control X as a cut option instead, which does not do the rippling. So this will leave you with a black space, as you can see if I scrub the timeline to right around here. So just for fun, let's add my channel avatar to the timeline here. So I brought it in to the media pool, and now I can have it snap to one of these video clips. And when I have it positioned nicely, I can let go. And by default, it's going to snap perfectly, which means there won't be any black space in between where I put it down and the first clip, as long as it's close enough to snap. So snapping is enabled right here with this magnet icon. By default, it's there, and in most cases, it's very helpful. So if you want to position clips or images or titles next to each other in a frame perfect manner, then you're probably going to want snapping enabled. So I can kind of demonstrate that once again by moving this clip over to the left so that it fits next to this profile image. So I'm going to drag this to the left, and notice the gray line that goes from top to bottom on the timeline over here. I let go, and we now have it snapped together. So if I go here, I can hit play, and it makes a nice cut to the third image. And it makes a nice cut to this third clip over here. There's also the trim tool over here. So trim is useful when you want to shave some frames off of the end or start of a clip that's on your timeline. So you can hit T to go into trim mode, or click here. And then if you go over to the edge of any clip on your timeline, you can left click and drag it around to shave frames off of whatever is in your timeline. So this is a nice tool for finalizing your clips and making sure that everything fits nicely together. So next we should talk about the effects library. By default, that is located down here in the bottom left-hand corner. If you don't see this window or any other window that I'm talking about, go up to the top bar up here with the icons and make sure that the window I'm talking about is white text. If it's grayed out like this, you're probably not going to see it. So make sure effects library is white there. So you have a few categories down here. Important ones to note: video transitions and titles and open effects. So video transitions, when you want to transition from one clip to another. For instance, I can add, let's do something that's very visual, something like an arrow iris. And I drag this between two clips, and then that will create a video transition, which is editable. So I can go here, hit play, and see my transition in the timeline. One of the new features of Resolve 17, though, is that for any of these effects or video transitions, you can actually hover over them to see a preview of how they would look like before they're even on the timeline. So that can save you a bit of time when you're picking out an effect and you're not sure how it's going to look. Titles, likewise, you can see the same thing. So if I go here for like dark box text, we can see how the title will look before I even put it onto the timeline. And so if I find a title I like, I can drag it onto the timeline. So I'm putting it here on video track 2. And the reason for that is so that it shows on top of the background video. So basically the text is on top, which is almost always what you want. And then in the inspector, as long as you left click on a title or a video clip, you'll have access to many settings you can change about those titles. So I'm just going to leave that there for now, and we'll actually come back to it a little later. So let's quickly touch on open effects. So anything that's not a video transition, as in trying to smooth out the move from one clip to another, is going to be in open effects for the most part. So let's add this one called light rays onto our clip. So if you want it on your video clip, you drag it from the effects library onto your clip. And now we have light rays on our video clip. So to edit that, we can left click on our video clip, go over to effects now, and there'll be this tab Open Effects, and we have settings we can change about that effect. So now what I want to show is editing a property and keyframing just really quickly here. So you can change any value you want, for instance, the length of the rays by left clicking on the value there and dragging it upwards or downwards to increase or decrease the strength of the property. And if you want to animate that through keyframing, then you simply find the part of your video where you want to start animating the property, set the value to its starting value. So I'll just have the length set to 0.1 here, and then I'll go a few frames or seconds ahead, and let's double the length there. So I'm going to put in 0.2 for the length, and you'll see how an additional red keyframe is added over here. So now that there's two keyframes, I can left click and go between them, left click, left click, and then left click on the right arrow. And if I want to play it back, I can go to where the first keyframe should be roughly, hit play, and see that property animate over time. So at a really simple level, that is actually how you animate properties and titles inside of Resolve 17. Okay, so now let's quickly move over to the cut page. So one of the things that is different about the cut page is that there's actually 3 timelines. So you have your full project timeline here, and you can see the first clip on the far left and then the right clip on the far right, since this is our entire timeline. At the bottom, we have another timeline that is about, I guess, like 12 seconds in the duration it shows at any given time. And when we hit play to view our video, the difference is that this timeline cursor stays in the center. So the timeline is always tracking wherever we are at the video. However, if we hit play in edit mode, then you'll see that the timeline cursor moves rather than the timeline itself. And then the third timeline is up here in the top right, which is kind of a frame by frame timeline. So whenever you're trying to do things like trim a video clip, the third timeline will show up here in the top right. So if I try to trim this left clip, then it'll show side by side the left and right video clips, so that if you're trying to sync up a shot, you can kind of see where it's going to end at the first clip on the left and start with the right clip on the left. And then the timeline itself just shows you how many frames you're taking off of one side or adding on to the other. So by dragging it there, I just took 5 frames off the left side, and I can go back a bit, hit play, and see how that will look in the final video. So if you position your timeline cursor where you want it to be and you left click on your video clip, there is the split clips option over here on the left side, which is going to make a cut on that clip and split it into 2. Another option is to hit Control B on your keyboard. So you don't need to even go into a blade edit mode. You can actually just use a keyboard shortcut to make that cut, and I find that to be much faster than clicking on split clips. So now that we have a cut here, we could easily add in another clip to our timeline. So if I double click on this basketball clip over here, we can bring part of it into our timeline. So another thing you can do when you want to limit the amount of footage you actually bring into the timeline is to position it where you want it to start in your timeline, hit I, go further into the video, and then find where you want to end that cut and hit O. So now we're setting in-out points rather than bringing in the entire video clip. And we can use these tools such as Smart Insert or Append to add them to the timeline. Of course, we could also just drag it in manually. But if we use something like Smart Insert, then it's going to find the nearest cut and it's going to put it right between there and push everything to the right forward. You do need to be careful though, because if it needs to push stuff forward and there's something like a title up here already, then it may split the title into 2. But as long as you're just working with one cut there, this is kind of handy because I'll hit Control Z real quick. You don't even have to position your timeline cursor perfectly. The smart feature is that if you hit Smart Insert and it detects a nearby cut, it'll put it in there perfectly without you having to line up the timeline cursor. So other options you can use, for instance, Append. It's going to add it to the very end of your video so you can see how this becomes the final clip. So just like on the edit page, you can use effects and titles. So instead of an effects library, they've been separated into their own categories up here. So if I click on effects, then I can find one that I like. For instance, we could throw on an edge detect effect, and I will just drag that onto this video clip. we can go ahead and preview it, how it outlines everything, and we can also hit spacebar to play it back if we want. So I don't believe it was there before, but in Resolve 17, the cut page also has an inspector window, which you can pop out here on the side. So just like on the edit workflow, we have access to all of the properties that we might want to edit about the effects or video clips that we're working on. So that's really handy. The inspector is really important if you're going to edit your video clips heavily. But for making really basic edits, you may not need the full inspector. There's also this icon here you can click on, Tools. And there are some simple settings you can play around with here. So for instance, you can crop the top of the video off a little bit by just clicking on the setting, dragging it inwards. And just like that, you've shrunken the video into a smaller state. And after making a crop adjustment, we can left click on the video clip in the preview window and drag this crop up and down as well until we get it where we want it to be. So one more new feature we find in the cut edit workflow is this quick export button. So normally you do exporting in the deliver tab, but if we click quick export, then we can quickly export our video project to a file. So without worrying too much about changing the details about your export, you can just see what it's going to export to, the resolution, duration, frame rate, so on and so forth. You can go ahead and hit export and you'll get a video file out of it. If you want to export it and to actually upload it to a different platform, you can click on something like YouTube, and you have to sign in to publish directly. So if you hit manage account, it'll give you an authentication window. So you sign into that and then you'll be able to upload straight to a YouTube channel or a Vimeo account or even a Twitter feed as a tweet. So that's there for you if you just want to export your video as quickly as possible. Now we can jump over to the Fusion page and just talk very briefly about it. So this is where we're going to come back to this title we added. Okay, yeah, there we have it. So let's go to the Fusion page. And what we're going to see with the Fusion title is this group of nodes that's been linked to the media output. So on the Fusion page, wherever you want a custom effect or a title you've created or are editing to output to the final video, it needs to feed to a media out node. And then in this title, we'll be able to see everything else that actually goes into creating that title on the screen by double clicking on the group. So we expand the group and now we can see all of the nodes here. So yes, it can be a little complicated, but if there is a setting that you don't see on the edit page when you go to the inspector, so inspector for the title, you can see your settings here, but it only shows you so many of them. So if you ever need to access the rest of the settings, then you go over to the Fusion page in order to edit those extra settings. You can even see next to the title that there is this little Go to Fusion page button. And then you can find the specific setting that you might want to change by clicking on the nodes and figuring out which one actually is the setting you need. So for instance, line color down here, I can left click on that. And I guess in this case, that's referring to the color of these lines. I can left click here and change the color. Let's just make it a green kind of randomly and hit OK. And just like that, we've updated the color. Now that specific setting might actually be up here. Line color, you can see that there. But there's going to be many others on these nodes where you can't have access to them. By the way, if you don't see the settings when you click on a node, just left click on the name of it and all of the other settings will drop down. So you can also add in other effects on the Fusion page. So I'm going to take this clip here and go over to the Fusion page. And when you click on a regular video clip, you're going to see media in going to media out here. So let's add a blur node in order to add a blur effect. So left click on the blur node, we'll have this down here. If you don't see them link up immediately when you click on it, then you can left click on the right side of one of these connection links and you can connect them up manually. So for this effect to work, media in needs to go to the orange on the blur one, which needs to go to media out. And now I can click on this blur and edit some details about the effect. So for instance, the blur size, I can increase this by a bunch. And now our video is quite blurry. I can go back to the edit page and I can still see that. Of course, open effects are also going to have blur effects. So that might not be the most useful node setup, but in Fusion, you can combine many nodes in order to create some pretty crazy stuff. But that's a little advanced for now. So we're going to move on to the color page. So on the color page, we have a bunch of color grading tools. So we can take the original color of our video and to make it more visually interesting for anyone who would be viewing the video clips. Now, before we start talking about how you can manually do this, there's also a shortcut option if you want a quick but decent auto color, then you can go to the color menu, come down here to auto color, and then left click here or hit Alt Shift C with your video clip selected. So Alt Shift C. And if I close a few windows, you'll be able to see how that rather saturated this image. So if I hit Control Z, you can see the original before the auto coloring. And then let's redo it to add the auto coloring back in. So you might decide that the auto coloring is helpful and add it in when you're editing your videos, since it's just a very quick option to get some results. Another way, you can also hit Control Z again and undo that to show another option, which is to use a color lookup table. So when you want to get a specific look onto your video, then you can use these LUTs, find a style that you like and apply it to your clip. So for instance, film looks here. Well, we can actually hover over them and then see how they will look in our specific clip. So you can find one that works for your video and then double click it to apply it. If you ever need to remove that or any color changes that you are making, then you can click on nodes, and then you'll see in the nodes the color grading changes that have been made here are indicated by these little symbols down here. So you might have seen an A for auto color or this grid thing for a lookup table, and we can right click and reset the node grade in order to just bring it back to the defaults. So when you want to manually change the colors of your video clips, you can do that using all of the tools at the bottom of the color window. So one of those is the color wheels, which allows you to shift around the colors depending on the highlights or the shadows of your video, using these options and moving them towards a certain color. Another is the color curves tools, where you can raise or lower red, green, and blue colors. You can also go over to there's also other curves such as hue versus hue. So if you want to shift one hue towards another hue, you can do that. Hue versus luminance curve, where you can take a particular hue of color and raise or lower the luminance of it. And then you also have the color warper tool, which is new to Resolve 17. So there is the color web, and there's also the color grid. So the idea is that you can take colors that, in this case, if you go over here, the most red colors, and shift those inwards to desaturate them, or shift the web towards, let's say, purple or more towards yellow to color shift around different parts of your video clip. So obviously the web is for changing the hue and the luminance, but if you go over to the grid, then you have colors in the top left and top right hand corner, and then you have the darker colors or the desaturated points towards the bottom. So there's another video on my channel where I did talk about these tools in a little bit more detail, but the idea is that you can move each individual pin around, and with these pins they also affect nearby pins, so you're kind of color shifting different regions. So it's an interesting visual way of adjusting the colors in your video until you get them just right. So one other basic thing that's definitely worth mentioning here is power windows. So when you do all of these color changing effects and you want to limit them to one region of your screen rather than everything, and this can also apply to blur effects, which can also be done on the color page, not just color changes, but you can actually limit them with a shape, such as clicking here for a rectangle, and now everything that you're affecting is only going to be contained within this one region. So in a sense, these power windows are masks for the effects you want to put over your video clips. And they come in other shapes than just squares as well. You can even draw your own shape custom with the pen tool. So if I just add a bunch of points here, we can get precisely the shape that we actually want. And it can drag around. You can also use tools like the tracker to track specific items as they move across your scene. For instance, people's faces would be a really common use for that. So I know, really brushing over that, there is so much more to the color page as well as the fusion page. Let's quickly touch on Fairlight and then deliver before wrapping up this video, just for the sake of time. And of course, if you want to learn more, I'm going to have other tutorials on my channel. So over on the Fairlight page, this is where you want to do audio editing. So you can see any audio clips that are on your timeline are already here, so I can navigate to them. I can hit play, listen to them back if I so desire. And you may decide you want to add some special audio effects over to them. So for instance, you could use a distortion effect if you want to manipulate someone's voice, and you can add that onto one or both of your audio track channels. Left click dragging it on there, and then you'll get one of these pop-up windows, which is going to have settings that you can manipulate to get the right sound effect. So I'm not going to demonstrate it here, but one of the things you can do is hit play in your timeline and play around with these settings as you progress on that audio clip. And you can actually just change those settings in real time. So it's much more helpful when you can actually listen to it back as you're making adjustments. A couple really common tools I like to use: noise reduction and dialogue processor. So you can drag those onto clips as well. You can also add them into an entire audio track over here in the mixer. So when you click on effects, you can go down to noise reduction, do Fairlight effects, and then noise reduction. Get the pop-up window here, and I might put it in auto speech mode, so that Resolve will pretty much remove the background noise without me having to do much about it. It'll just automatically focus on the speech, keep that, and then remove the background information. So since we added that to an audio track, that means that it's going to be applying to everything in the final export that is on this audio track. You can see it has a FX symbol here, which means there's some effects applied to the entire audio track. By doing it that way, you don't have to apply it to each clip individually, so that's pretty handy. Okay, one other thing I want to point out is that DaVinci Resolve is compatible with VST audio effects. So if you have any installed in your computer, such as Error 4, then you can use these tools as well, and you'll still get those same pop-up windows. So for instance, plosive removers. If you don't have, let's say, if you were recording without a pop filter like this right here, then you could go in with the plosive remover and remove some of the popping noises. Obviously, it's better to set things up better from the start, but if you need to remove stuff in post-production, then that is one of the things you can use some of these audio effects for. So let's quickly touch on exporting your video using the Deliver tab. So let's expand the timeline down here so we can see it there using the zoom tools. In the top left, you have render settings, but honestly, I usually don't personally have to do too much with that. The default format of QuickTime.move is just fine for most internet applications. If you do need to change the format though, you can select from this list another format like MP4. And you also have other settings you can play around with down here. Note that any settings you want to change about the audio require going to the different tab, but the main thing you're going to need to do is choose a actual file name and a location on your computer. So I could go here and just call this quick guide or something. So I could go up to the top here for file name and just call it, and then browse for a location on the computer. So for instance, the desktop could be an option, and if I hit save there, then we have a location to export to. So all we would need to do to export the entire timeline, so notice render down here in the bottom says entire timeline, which means everything on the timeline. Add to render queue, you select your video, and then you can go ahead and hit render all. So aside from that, a couple things to note. You have those YouTube, Vimeo, Twitter options here. So if you want to upload directly to those platforms, you can check down here, but you do need to be signed into them. So if you check upload directly to Vimeo, then what you want to do is before you actually export, make sure that you go to DaVinci Resolve menu at the top left, preferences, and then go to internet accounts, and make sure that you actually signed into these accounts, or else it won't be able to upload and publish directly to those sites for you. So when you do upload directly to the sites like YouTube, you may be able to set a title and description here before you upload, and whether or not you want the visibility to be private before you go in and manually edit it on your internet accounts like YouTube. Generally, I would recommend you keep the visibility private until you log into the sites and actually edit it and make sure everything's fine for final publication. So another way to render is you can actually render part of your timeline instead of the entire one. So whenever you want to select part of your timeline, you can hit I to set an endpoint, and then go to where you want it to end, and then hit O to set an out point. So by doing that, you'll see that the render setting here got changed to in out range. So if you want to go between the two options of entire timeline or in out range, you can click on the render drop down here. So entire timeline if you want to export everything, or in out range if you want to select a part of your video timeline to export to a file rather than the entire thing. Whenever you go back to in out range though, you do need to set the in out points again. So go to the part where you want the in point and hit I, and then go to the part where you have out point and hit O, and then you can hit add to render queue. So now we have two jobs queued up. So you can either select a single job and hit render, or if you want to select all of your jobs and render them all at once, In the case that you're exporting multiple videos, just select them all and then hit render all on the right. But in a nutshell, that is pretty much it for the basics of DaVinci Resolve 17. Obviously, there's a lot more you can do with this video editor. So I hope you guys enjoyed taking a quick look at the rundown of the program and some of the new features such as quick export and the color warper that exists in the new beta version. And if you're looking to learn more about the video editor program, you can check my channel out for many other tutorials on the subject from DaVinci Resolve 17 and earlier versions. So with that, I've been Chris. Thanks for watching this video to the end, and I'll see you guys in my future video content.